If it is necessary that I should forfeit my life and mingle my blood further with the blood of millions in this slave country, then I submit.
These were the words of John Brown spoken just days before his execution in 1859. They reflect his unwavering commitment to ending slavery, a cause for which he would give up his life. His execution came a mere 16 months before Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter. Had he lived to see that day, he would not have been surprised. He had predicted that the South would secede and the nation would be torn asunder over the issue of slavery. The raid on Harper's Ferry, Bleeding Kansas, the Potawatomi Massacre, these are all events that are familiar to any student of American history. The discussion of whether John Brown was a terrorist or a hero is one that continues in classes around America. Yet, something that is often overlooked is John Brown's personal religious beliefs and how his faith shaped his entire worldview. It was a fire that drove him forward all the way till his final breath. And even as his body lay moldering in the grave, it was under that anthem that thousands of Union troops would march into battle. John Brown was born on May 2nd, 1800, in a small town in Connecticut. He grew up in a devout Christian family that actively participated in the Underground Railroad. He was raised to believe that slavery was a sin against God and that it was his duty as God's servant to oppose it at all costs. In fact, the Browns were not only opposed to slavery, but also rejected the idea of racism altogether, a stance that was rare among Northerners and Southerners alike. John Brown grew up to be both stubborn and strict. On one occasion, he stepped outside in the middle of winter wearing nothing more than a shirt and shorts. When a neighbor told him to go back inside, he replied, "Keeping warm is a mere act of the will." He held high moral standards for not only himself, but also his children and those around him. On one occasion, one of his poor neighbors was caught stealing a cow. While the owner of the cow felt sorry for the man and chose not to seek compensation, John, as a strong believer in justice, pressed charges. While the man was serving his sentence, John went out of his way to provide food and money for the thief's family. It was John's unique way of demonstrating both the justice and mercy of God. When it came to religion, John Brown was a steadfast Calvinist. He dedicated every single morning and evening to the reading of scripture and prayer. Through his study of the Bible, John believed that God spoke to him personally. And although he originally intended to train as a minister, he struggled to complete his religious studies. And whenever he opened the scriptures, no subject angered him more than that of slavery. John believed strongly that the Bible had explicitly condemned slavery, a view not widely shared by many other conservative Christians of his time. John's beliefs diverged from those of his northern peers in three ways. Number 1, all races are created equal as image bearers of God. As such, it is a sin to consider one race as superior to another. Number 2, violence is an acceptable means of enacting justice in extreme circumstances. Number 3, a non-violent solution to slavery was impossible. He justified this belief by arguing that slavery was by its very nature violent.
John Brown was an unusual man. He treated black men on exactly the same footing as white men.
These differences often caused him to be disliked by his Free State neighbors. He continually butted heads with other churchgoers because he insisted on breaking bread with blacks. Yet John was never swayed to the majority views of his community. It was this conviction that one evening led to John standing at the back of a church to make a declaration.
I, John Brown, pledge myself, with God's help, that I will devote my life to ending slavery.
It was a pledge that John would uphold. When John failed his religious studies, he was forced to abandon his dreams of becoming a minister. This setback compelled him to rethink his future plans. He shifted his life focus from ministerial work to the mission of ending slavery. By the age of 20, John had already planned out his entire life's purpose. He would start a business and use the profits to buy arms for a violent uprising against slavery. Unfortunately for John, his businesses consistently fell short of the success he had envisioned. Despite these disappointments, John used his enterprises to improve the lives of his black neighbors. His businesses became crucial stops on the Underground Railroad, and he prioritized hiring black employees, offering opportunities that most businesses at the time denied. John moved frequently, and in many of the towns where he lived, he was the only white who attended black churches. This behavior attracted prominent black leaders of the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass had this to say about John Brown.
Though a white gentleman, he is in sympathy a black man, and is as deeply interested in our cause as though his own soul had been pierced with the iron of slavery. Certainly, I never felt myself in the presence of a stranger religious influence than while in John Brown's house.
No story better illustrates the uniqueness of John Brown than this one. 1 year before his execution, John Brown and a squad of men rescued 11 slaves who were about to be auctioned. Brown personally escorted the group from Missouri to Detroit, where they escaped to Canada. The rescue provoked outrage. Both the federal government and the state of Missouri placed bounties on Brown's head. Many conservative Northerners were appalled that John Brown had quote-unquote stolen property. When questioned about his justification, a furious John Brown pointed to the Exodus story, in which God appointed Moses to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. To those who knew him, John Brown was not a fanatic, but a man driven by a profound love for humanity, both black and white. Above all, it was his faith that motivated him. John providentially believed that God had created him for the sole purpose of ending slavery. His unwavering convictions allowed him to resist the pressures of those around him. John viewed every trial he faced as preparation for his ultimate struggle, a major slave revolt that John himself would lead, to bring an end to slavery once and for all. The following years did nothing to temper John Brown's short fuse. In the decade leading up to his raid on Harper's Ferry, 3 key events ignited his righteous indignation. The passing of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act changed how Northerners viewed slavery. Under the new law, all Americans were required to assist in returning escaped slaves to their masters. Those who refused would face fines, and anybody caught simply aiding fugitives, such as giving them food or shelter, would also be penalized. Slave catchers only needed an affidavit to claim a person as an escaped slave, and since the accused could not have legal representation, this led to several instances of free blacks being kidnapped and sold into slavery. Previously, many apathetic Northerners had regarded slavery as a distant issue, confined to the South. The new law, however, brought slavery into the backyard of Northerners, outraging them, as they were now being forced to participate in an institution they detested. Unsurprisingly, John Brown was among the most incensed, becoming convinced that slavery could not be ended without violence. At the time, John Brown was living in Springfield, Massachusetts. There, he created an armed group called the League of Gileadites to defend local black residents. Named after the biblical story of Gideon's 300 men defeating a Midianite army, the League consisted of 3 blacks determined to protect their community from slave catchers. But they never came. The reputation of the League had dissuaded any slave catcher from stepping foot into Springfield. Although the League never saw combat, it had successfully safeguarded the local black population. John Brown could not have been more pleased. His willingness to use force to oppose slavery had proven effective. His conviction that violence was necessary to end slavery had only grown. It was a conviction that would only be strengthened in the years to come. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 caused yet another national crisis over slavery. It allowed the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide, by popular vote, whether to permit slavery. Soon, both territories saw an influx of settlers from both North and South, each hoping to tip the scales in their favor. Armed groups from slave state Missouri stormed into neighboring Kansas and raided free state settlements. Pro-slavery President Franklin Pierce exacerbated the problem by installing a pro-slavery governor and ignoring the violence unfolding in Bleeding Kansas. The news of the crimes committed by the border ruffians infuriated John Brown. Some of his sons, who had already settled in Kansas, were besieged and desperately needed help. Brown decided to move to Kansas and also bring a bunch of firearms along with him. Now, the fight was personal. He was determined to protect his family from pro-slavery aggression. Upon arrival, John was frustrated not only by the border ruffians, but also by the passivity of his fellow Free State settlers. The mostly non-violent Northerners refused to fight back against the gangs, which John interpreted as cowardice. John took command of a militia called the Liberty Guards, a group of Free State men who fought against pro-slavery forces. Under his leadership, the militia successfully defeated a pro-slavery group at the Battle of Blackjack. Old John Brown hadn't come to Kansas to settle, but to fight. However, the event that pushed Brown over the edge was when an entire Free State settlement was looted and burned to the ground. When John Brown heard of the sacking of Lawrence, he was compelled to act.
Now something must be done. We have got to defend our families and our neighbors as best we can. We must show by actual work that there are 2 sides to this thing and that they cannot go on without impunity.
Brown organized a group to find and kill those responsible for the attack. Armed with broadswords, his group killed 5 men who had participated in the sacking of Lawrence. The Potawatomi Massacre, as it has become known, helped gain Brown notoriety throughout both the North and South. When asked about the killings, John Brown simply replied,
"God is my judge. It was absolutely necessary as a measure of self-defense and the defense of others."
Despite his willingness to use violence, Brown insisted that he did not hate slaveholders. His fight was not against them as individuals, but against the sin of slavery. His growing fame allowed him to tour northern states to raise funds for his next venture, arming an entire army for the upcoming slave rebellion. In John's ideal world, the need to fundraise would have been unnecessary. His own business ventures would have provided enough funds to arm the rebellion. But in reality, most of his business ventures came to ruin and left John with a massive pile of debts. Thus, John turned to supporters like the Secret Six, a group of 6 wealthy New England businessmen who discreetly financed his efforts. Brown's plan was to incite a major slave revolt and recruit freed slaves to join his army. The revolutionaries would retreat to remote mountain communities, making it difficult for federal troops to find them. There, they would form a provisional republic for which John Brown had even written a constitution. The Provisional Constitution incorporated many of John's personal political and religious beliefs. It emphasized the importance of family, school, and the church, while also including strict moral regulations. It prohibited filthy language, indecent conduct, drunkenness, fighting, and fornication. Other unusual provisions included bans on needless waste of livestock and resources, and on laziness. Many of those who John Brown presented with the plans were skeptical of its chances of success. Although Frederick Douglass held Brown in high regard, he was never sold on the whole slave revolt idea. Douglass had strongly dissuaded Brown from attacking Harper's Ferry. However, rather than listen to the criticism, Brown stubbornly insisted,
"If God is for us, who can be against us?"
Brown drew encouragement from past revolts and revolutions. He extensively studied the French Revolution and the life of Toussaint Louverture, who led the Haitian Slave Rebellion to success. The Nat Turner Rebellion was also a major inspiration. The revolters had fled into the mountains, making it difficult for the government to find them. With slight adjustments, Brown was confident that his own revolt would succeed. But deep down, John must have known the risks. Whether the uprising succeeded or failed, he believed that God could providentially use the outcome. And that was reason enough to go through with the plan.
Did not my Master, Jesus Christ, come down from heaven and sacrifice himself upon the altar for the salvation of the race? And should I, a worm not worthy to crawl under his feet, refuse to sacrifice myself?
Before his raid, Brown experienced a series of prophecies that hinted at the fate awaiting him. After receiving communion for the last time before the raid, a young black woman prophesied that if John went south, it would lead to his doom. This was not the only prophecy. John's son Owen had a dream in which he saw John, quote, on a scaffold about to be hung. Another of his children, Annie, recalled an incident where John killed a snake just as it was about to strike at some birds. John had asked her if she believed that this was, quote, an omen of impending success in fighting on behalf of the slaves. Even Harriet Tubman received dreams about John Brown. In one, she saw a serpent in the wilderness, when the serpent transformed into the head of an old man with a long, white beard. Then, two younger heads appeared beside the old man's head. Tubman didn't understand the dream's meaning until she heard the news from Virginia. Brown was to be executed, and two of his sons had been killed in the raid. John Brown believed he would triumph over the serpent in the garden, but rather he himself became the serpent lifted up in the wilderness, a sign of hope through the death of a man. The providential hand of God moved once more. John Brown genuinely believed his slave revolt would succeed. He thought that enslaved blacks would eagerly jump at the opportunity to break their chains and join the resistance. Perhaps his unyielding zeal had blinded him, or perhaps his stubbornness was his downfall. Had he listened to Frederick Douglass, he might have understood that most Americans, slave or free, were uninterested in a violent uprising against slavery. The raid was short, and many of the raiders were killed. John Brown himself miraculously survived. The soldier who attacked him had mistakenly taken his decorative parade sword rather than his combat saber. Following his capture, John was interrogated by government officials, militiamen, and curious onlookers. He maintained that his actions were in service to God and devoted to helping the poor and powerless, those who could not help him back. During his imprisonment, two Methodist preachers came to pray with him. Brown asked one of the ministers if he believed in slavery. When the minister answered yes, John responded,
I do not want prayers of any man that believes in slavery.
The trial, held in the slave state of Virginia, ended in less than a week. The jury unanimously sided against Brown. He remarked that had he acted on behalf of the rich and powerful, he would be applauded and rewarded for his actions. Instead, he acted according to the will of God and yielded his life for that cause. Between the raid and his execution, Brown commanded headlines on the front pages of newspapers from both slave and free states. Brown was well aware of this. From prison, he spent much of his time answering questions from reporters and writing letters. In one letter, he wrote that his execution would do vastly more toward advancing the cause than all he had done in his life before. On the day before his execution, John wrote a final note to his wife, who had come to Virginia to meet him.
Today is my last day upon earth. Tomorrow I shall see God. I have no fear. I am not afraid to die. And I can say the words of our blessed Savior, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do.
The Civil War would begin just over 1 year after John Brown was executed for treason. Ironically, none of the treasonous Southerners would hang for their crimes against the state. It seems as if the iniquity of slavery had been laid squarely upon the shoulders of John Brown. Similarly to another famous figure, John Brown died for the sins of people who utterly despised him. And so, even in death, his soul still marches on.